Last time on Star Trek Voyager.
I think I want to do some engine and transmission work first. And I've got a new tool in the barn that's going to help me do that. It's a really, really big tool, and it's really, really cool. So that'll be next.
And now the conclusion.
So in the last episode, the interior of the car got a complete overhaul. The carpets were replaced with brand new ones, and the seats were redone with a complete upholstery kit from Mr. Mike. A custom fuel level sender solution was fabricated, and the steering column was completely rebuilt to fix the wobbling issue. And I should make a note regarding the nasty mold that was covering all of the door panels and the other parts of the car. It is important to mention that even though we used this mold and mildew spray that was designed to neutralize the mold, it still would have been smart to wear a respirator at all times. I did when I was working inside the car, but not outside. Even though there was lots of ventilation, being out in the open, it still would have been best practice for all of us to wear PPE, including gloves. So be sure to think about those things if you're doing anything similar. But with the car no longer a health hazard to be inside, it's time to take a look at the drivetrain.
So the car is running and driving, but it could be a heck of a lot better. I for sure want to replace the clutch and rear main seal as well as the water pump at the very least. And dropping the entire subframe assembly would make that a heck of a lot easier. The whole transmission, engine, everything. And since the suspension is going to be part of that package too, and I was already planning on taking all of that out and rebuilding it, I'm thinking that dropping the entire subframe assembly is going to be my best bet.
So using an engine crane to raise the rear of the Fiero is what people have been doing for years in the DIY community. I'm fortunate enough to now have access to a 48-inch car lift. Roman, one of my best friends, had been working on his Volkswagen bus projects here on my parents' property. And since he had planned to be here for quite some time and wanting to do a full engine and transmission rebuild, he convinced my dad to go in 50-50 with him on this car lift. I am extremely fortunate because I know that a lot of people doing budget rebuilds like myself aren't necessarily going to have access to a tool like this, let alone family and friends that would buy one and install it in your backyard. I am very grateful. But with Roman's projects nearing the end, the barn is now back in business for Fieros. And like I said, let's go ahead and drop this engine.
Wait a minute. I've never done anything this big. I've never dropped an entire subframe assembly before. I don't even know where to begin.
So, you want to drop the subframe assembly out of your automobile, is that right? And this is your first time too, isn't it? Doesn't it almost feel a little overwhelming? Well, that's perfectly normal. After all, it is a very big job. But don't worry. It can be broken up into smaller jobs that make the entire process very easy. Firstly, we have the hoses, with fuel, vacuum, coolant, and air conditioning. Secondly are the cables, both throttle cables and the shifter cables. Next is all of the electrical wiring. There is the ECU to unplug, all ground wires to remove, as well as the main positive wiring. There are also small things like the air intake, brake calipers, e-brake cables, and the slave cylinder that can all be undone from their mounting location. Last but most certainly not least are the bolts attaching the assembly to the main chassis. There are the main subframe bolts, the shock absorber bolts, and lastly the dog bone that is mounted up at the top of the engine. Now, let's see those small jobs in action. Not so bad, huh? Look at you go! Wow, Ronnie, you are natural. Congratulations, Ronnie. You did it. So, this seemingly difficult big job was made very easy after breaking it down into smaller jobs. Wouldn't you say so?
Well, no. It definitely helped a lot. It made it a lot less overwhelming going into it, but there was still a lot of work involved. It was still very tedious and time consuming, so I don't think you're right to say that it was easy.
Oh, you little shit, come here!
So yeah, this is the whole shebang. I actually did it with the help of my buddy Jordan, and it took us about 5 hours to do so. And if it wasn't clear, we did drain all of the fluids out of the car beforehand. The biggest help for this endeavor was just a manual that documented the whole process in very clear steps. Whether it's Haynes, Chilton, or a factory manual, one of these for your car is truly worth every penny that it costs, which in my case was $18. So getting it out in one big piece was really nice, even if all these parts together look very daunting. The biggest thing, for me at least, is the wiring. I hate wiring so much. I made sure to get a 3-minute long reference video showing where everything goes. But with the engine now out of the car entirely, I'd be remiss not to go ahead and just replace everything that I can. So, without further ado, let's start tearing this thing down. After that, the whole thing was brought outside and given a good degreaser shower and a brass bristle brush scrub. It took a few minutes and a little bit of elbow grease, but finally, most of the oil and grime was removed. You can see just how much there was on this side alone. The engine's temporary new home is going to be this brand new stand, but it's not quite as easy as just bolting it on there, since the transmission has to be removed in order to do so. And there's only one engine mount. The other side is attached to the transmission, and if those go, the engine would just fall. So that's where this guy comes in. Getting it hooked up was a little awkward, with the wheels of the cart being in the way of the crane, but I eventually got it. Removing the trans was straightforward. Just the main bolts and nuts that made it to the engine, a few screws that hold the dust shield on, then it was just a little bit of prying and a little bit of wiggling before the whole thing was separated. Not too bad though. Next was the pressure plate. And then the flywheel. Houston, the Eagle has landed. As much as I want to dive right into this, I'm actually not going to. I'll be starting with the transmission. That way, as soon as I finish the engine, the other half of the drivetrain will already be ready to go. This guy was also super grimy. More degreaser was used everywhere, but unlike earlier, a power washer was used this time. The block is pretty much just flat sides, which is easy enough to scrub, but with this being such an odd shape that also has so many structural ribs, a power washer was the way to go. I also made sure to plug the output holes with rags so no water gets in there. I avoided spraying directly in that area, as well as around sensors. A little splashing on them is totally fine though. Fun fact, this transmission, the 4-cylinder specific 5-speed transmission, is Japanese. It's designed and manufactured by Isuzu. So I guess a Fiero is pretty much just an MR2. Just kidding, the Fiero isn't as high quality. So with the transmission now mostly clean, I wanted to address these oxidized brackets. I addressed them by removing the rust and paint entirely with my secret weapon, and then painted the steel pieces gloss black with Rust-Oleum automotive enamel paint. For the cast aluminum pieces, I painted those with Krylon silver high heat paint. It doesn't have to be high heat, but I already had purchased a lot for restoring some of these heat shields for the engine bay. The main reason I wanted to remove those brackets was actually to get to this, the transmission shift selector mechanism. I'm not rebuilding the transmission, not even close, but I do want to replace all of the seals I can get to, and this one being the most tedious to take care of, I wanted to tackle it first. To get to the seal, the whole little assembly has to come completely apart. The first thing to go is this roll pin that locks the selector arm in place. I already got it a little bit started as you can see, but to finish it off, I very carefully squatted on the ground and smashed a drill bit into the other end of the hole. Next was the snap ring here on the end. I should probably invest in snap ring pliers, but until I do, I'll just keep struggling with flathead screwdrivers. With that removed, the whole assembly can slide out. And now for the main culprit. A hammer and flathead made pretty easy work of removing it, but I did manage to nick the bushing here. That was easily remedied with some very fine wet sanding though. Before putting it all back together, I want to remove all of the rust that was on the shaft, so that way I can ensure that there will be a good seal. So while the rust remover is doing its thing, I wanted to go back to cleaning more. My god, let me tell you that oven cleaner works absolute wonders. Seriously, you can see the grime just falling off. The only thing is though, that it's not meant to be used on aluminum, like it says on the can. Don't panic, it's fine. I checked on the manufacturer's website and it doesn't harm anything. It just discolors aluminum. So while it is perfectly clean now, it isn't pretty and shiny anymore. That kinda sucks, but hey, there's no harm done. It still looks loads better, so I really can't be too upset. But at this point, the shaft has been cleaned off and all rust is gone. But to be extra sure that it's good, I used some metal polish and a jewelry rag. There's some slight discoloration up here, but that's okay since it is smooth, as well as the fact that this far up the shaft never comes in contact with the seal. So we're good. To install the new seal, I took a page out of Mike from Fuzzy Dice Project's book and applied a little bit of blue Loctite around that perimeter. A socket the same size as the seal was used to press it squarely in place. And with the excess wiped up, it was now time for reassembly. I gave everything a good coating of oil so it all goes together smoothly. The shaft was inserted, then the selector arm, and then the reverse lockout mechanism arm. There is a dot on that part that lines up with the middle ridge of the shift select arm. And after the spring and washer were put in, I could hammer the roll pin back in place. Lastly was struggling for a while with screwdrivers.
Nice.
But finally, it was all put back together. The gasket surface was cleaned of all residue from the tape that covered it. Then the mechanism was bolted back down. Now it was time to install these guys back on. The slide bracket was bolted in place. Then the slider linkage was attached with some grease on the pin. Then everything was held in place with this tiny clip. Nice, it all still works. Then the last of the brackets were bolted in place. Next I removed the old throwout bearing. I couldn't even get it to spin, so it was definitely time for this to be replaced. The input shaft was cleaned up and I gave it a teeny tiny bit of oil. Then I slid on the new bearing and clipped it to the arms of the shaft. And next were the output shaft seals. After removing the original one, I followed the manual and used a block of wood to hammer the new one into place and immediately ruined it.
Oh, you gotta be
After the embarrassment wore off and a new one was purchased, I used a socket of the correct size to hammer it in place. That went on a lot better. The same was done for the other side. Removal of the old one and insertion of the new one. Now, we are left with one completely serviced transmission. And I think with some regular fluid changes, this thing will last a long time. But now, let's get to tearing down this engine. The crank pulley came off after removing these 3 bolts, and also after applying a little bit of leverage. Next, I took off the plastic guide for part of the wiring harness. And then did the last of the cleaning on the block. And after that was the valve cover.
beautiful.
Then all of the rocker arms were loosened up and taken off one by one. Along with the push rods too. I also made sure to keep both of those things in the correct order in which they came off the engine. There's better methods than laying them on a cardboard sheet on the ground, but hey, whatever works. Next was the cylinder head. There's a specific sequence in which the bolts are tightened when installing this, so to remove it, they were just loosened in the reversed order. I gave the head some slight taps with the dead blow hammer to break it loose, but there were a couple bolts still in there, that way it won't go flying. Or falling rather. This thing is cast iron and very heavy.
Terrible.
So there's a lot of garbage in here. The carbon is just from age, but everything else, I don't even know. Surprisingly enough, and it may be difficult to see, but there's still decent cross-hatching on the cylinder walls, so that's great. To clean everything up, I gave it a good spray with lots of WD-40 and then lots of scrubbing with a brass brush. Brass is pretty important here. I don't want to use steel and potentially scar the surface. But after a lot, and I mean a lot of scrubbing, these were starting to clean up very well. Seriously, going from this to this. That's not too bad at all. Also, I made sure to thoroughly clean the cylinder walls and rub them down with oil. This looks almost brand new. It seriously is amazing how good these look. But there's probably a good amount of you wondering why I spent so much time cleaning these pistons while they're still in the engine if I'm doing a full rebuild, or why I'm even keeping the Iron Duke engine at all. Well, for the first question, I'm not exactly doing a full rebuild. It's going to be more of a full refresh. A big thing is time and money saved by not doing a full rebuild, but the main reason is that the engine honestly doesn't run poorly. And after inspecting all of the bearings and cam lobes after this was all apart, I can tell you that there was no scarring or unusual wear on anything. This is just an old leaky engine that seemed to have been serviced regularly. Thank you for that, Susie and Bruce. So by full refresh, what I mean is that I'm going to thoroughly clean everything, paint some parts that need some love, and replace every gasket and seal to ensure that there are no more leaks, as well as doing a basic rebuild on the cylinder head. As for why I'm keeping it, these engines are workhorses. As I said in part 1, the Iron Duke is what powers the Grumman LLV mail trucks, and those guys have to last for a very long time. As long as you're not constantly revving the engine to redline thinking you're impressing people like some douche, and keep up with regular maintenance, these engines can last for hundreds of thousands of miles. I hope to put at least another 100,000 on this car in my lifetime, and with as good of a foundation that this engine is, and after all the work I put into it, I have the utmost confidence that it'll go the distance. So, with the engine torn down as far as I'll be taking it, it's time to clean up, take a break, and go order some parts. The first thing to clean up was the oil pan. The inside looked new after wiping everything away. Cleaning the outside, however, was more of the oven cleaner. I let it do its thing, gave it a good scrub, then rinsed all of it off. There was still a little bit of surface rust on the outside, so I made sure to knock that all back with a wire wheel. And after scuffing up the entire outer surface, I gave it 2 good coats of that same automotive enamel paint. The timing cover was more of the same. Spray, scrub, rinse, and seal removal. But unlike the oil pan, I wanted to take it a step further, so I was going to bring back my secret weapon, and that is this Eastwood blasting cabinet. Matt from Eastwood reached out to me and asked if I wanted to integrate some of their products into my videos. I said, yep, good, that sounds, yes please. So he sent me one of their modular blasting cabinets, and it's been absolutely fantastic. I got it running with a used Harbor Freight compressor from a friend, and also a water separator to try to do something about this 95% Houston humidity. I still need to figure out something better for this though. But yeah, thanks Matt, and thank you Eastwood. If you aren't already aware of the great company that they are, I highly encourage you to go check them out. And with this cover blasted clean and looking good, it was given a nice coat of paint. The water outlet cover panel had seen much better days. There was a lot of pitting on here, so to be sure that there won't be any leaks, I filled all of the pitting with JB Weld. This is steel reinforced epoxy, so it's more than durable enough to withstand the temperatures of the engine coolant. Its only purpose is to provide a smooth surface so there's a good seal, and it's more than capable of that too. With that hit with some high heat engine enamel paint, it was ready to go back on the block. But I didn't stop here with the bracket and panel restoration. I cleaned up every single stamped metal and cast aluminum part. I wanted this thing to look good. So with all of those done, let's move forward with the engine. Like I said earlier, all of the internal components looked great. Definitely used, but by no means bad or compromising. I've already checked out the oil pump, cleaned off all gasket surfaces, and replaced the seal and gasket for the distributor. I still need to clean that. The first piece to go back on was the timing cover. A brand new seal was installed in the front with a hammer and a big ol' socket, just like the transmission. For the new paper gasket, it isn't entirely necessary to use a gasket sealant, but it absolutely helps. That was brushed on, let dry for a minute, then placed onto the cover. That was repeated once more, and then put onto the block. It also helps to install it with the crank flange in place, That way you can ensure that the seal is concentric with the crank. The bolts were all started with the electric ratchet and then torqued down to spec. Or as the craftsman might say, everything was tightened down until the correct snuggativity was reached. Next was the oil pan. The surface was already cleaned off, but to ensure it was spotless, I went over everything with some brake cleaner. For the seal, I used Ultra Black RTV from Permatex. This stuff is specifically for oil resistance. I started by squeezing some onto the seam between the timing cover and the block. Then, slowly but surely working my way around the entire thing, making sure to keep the bead continuous. I then went back and circled all of the bolt holes, and then placed the pan on and started securing it into place. The instructions for this step says to tighten the bolts until there's a little bit of squeeze out, wait a full hour, then come back and torque everything to spec. So while the timer for the pan started, I went ahead and installed the water outlet cover. For this, I used Ultra Gray RTV. I was worried at first that I should have used the red high heat RTV here, but the gray stuff is rated up to 500 degrees Fahrenheit, and on the website it says that it's suitable for coolant fittings, so this will work just fine. And after tightening the bolts down with a little bit of thread sealant, it was left to sit for an hour. Then, everything was torqued to spec. And I gotta say, it would be pretty much impossible for me to put this thing back together if it weren't for this. A tray organizer has been the most useful tool for the whole project. Seriously. But after a day of drying, the block was flipped back over and cleaned up since there was a little bit of oil that started draining out when it was upside down. The next step, though, was taking care of this old, tired cylinder head.
Hey YouTube, it's me again. I just wanted to say I may or may not be making another appearance in this series. I know you guys have been asking a lot about me, and just I really appreciate it, so thank you.
Like the rest of the engine, it's in pretty good shape. It's just a little dirty and needs some attention. The valves seem to be decent, the outside is caked in oil, and there's a good amount of carbon on the underside, which is all to be expected. And after popping out the spark plugs and coolant temp sensors, we can start taking this apart. A $15 spring compressor from Amazon was used for this, and let me just tell you, it was definitely a $15 spring compressor. It started to bend itself out far before it did any compressing, but it got the job done. After the spring was compressed enough, I could remove the two tiny little keepers that hold the springs in place. Then everything could be removed. The seal up at the top had turned rock hard and pretty much just crumbled away. After sliding the valve out, the lower positive seal, which is only on the intake valves, was popped off too. And here you can see the difference between the bases. The stepped one is for the intake seal. It wasn't until the very last valve that I got the hang of using this cheap tool. The secret is to tighten it down until right when you feel it bend itself out, then give both sides of the tool a good smack. The keepers being so tightly stuck on there is what makes it difficult to compress. But once it's popped free though, it's really easy to work with. Nice! And just like the rocker arms and push rods, it's best practice to keep everything in the same order in which it came off. The head does have some issues, like a bolt being so horribly stuck in there that I couldn't hammer it out even after an hour of trying to do so, and another part of the bolt that snapped off in here from the mishap back in part 4, as well as a deck that could use some surfacing. To take care of those things properly, I brought it to an engine shop downtown, and with the head there, I can spend my time cleaning up these valves. Kinda like these. They don't need to be spotless, especially since carbon buildup is inevitable, but it definitely helps with the rebuild process. A super easy trick to clean these is to chuck them into a drill, and as they're spinning, go over them with a Scotch-Brite pad. It doesn't require a lot of force, so don't worry, a lot of the work will be done for you. I also tried my best to stay only on the base of the valve. I didn't want to risk causing a bad seal by messing with the main shaft. Not too bad though. And while I was at it, I went ahead and cleaned up the push rods as well. With these looking good and after a week had passed, the head is back from the machine shop. The valve cover bolt was repaired and the head has been surfaced smooth. I also gave it a nice coat of black paint to help with the rusting cast iron. The last thing to do for the head is to make sure there's a good seal for all of the valves. And to do this, I'll be doing what's called valve lapping. It's basically just wet sanding, but using a special valve grinding paste as the abrasive. With it squirted around the valve base and the shaft lubricated with oil, it's placed into the head. And with a tiny little plunger suction to the valve, just go to town. You really don't press down though, just back and forth until you can audibly hear it get softer, then spin it around and repeat and repeat. And after about a minute or so of doing that, you go from a valve seat looking like this to one like this. The valve also has a nice smoother ring around it now. The exhaust valve was done the same, and the seat looked good, but the valve itself, not so much. This is common with exhaust valves. A little more work was done, and now the pitting on the valve was now at an acceptable level. So now with all of the valves elapsed and thoroughly cleaned, along with the head itself, it's now time to put it all back together. With new seals, of course. For the intake valves, there's a little plastic sleeve that covers the grooves that's used for installing the bottom seal. That way it won't get caught and torn on the hard edges of the grooves. The springs are added and compressed. The oiled up seal gets slid down to the second groove. Then the keeper's installed, and then the spring is decompressed. It's given a good whack with a dead blow hammer just to make sure it's all good. The same was done for the exhaust valve, and then the rest. And now, it's ready to go on the block. The mating surface was wiped clean using a solvent and a rag, as well as the cylinder head. And after spending a lot of time making sure there were no fibers left over, the head was set on the block. New cylinder head bolts were lubricated and added in. And heavyweight motor oil could have been used here, but I used 3-in-1 oil for this. The type of lubricant doesn't really matter, at least for OEM replacements. The difference in the oil's viscosity essentially has no effect on how well it's installed. Just as long as it's not dry, that's all that matters. And like I mentioned earlier, these have a proper sequence in which they're torqued down, so I followed that and the specific instructions that came with the bolts very carefully. The head was now on good and tight. Next were the hydraulic roller lifters. These were given a good cleaning, a soak in some oil, and then slid into the engine, but not before putting on a little bit of assembly lube on the bottom, just to help out when this thing first starts. With the rest added in too, and the anti-rotation brackets added, I can now move up to the top. Some more assembly lube was added to the lifters, and then all the push rods were put in place. And then the rocker arms were added, also with a little bit of assembly lube. This style of rocker arm doesn't have any preload or lash to adjust, so they're just bolted down to a specific torque value, which in my case is 20 foot-pounds. There's going to be a cork gasket that goes on here, and Permatex recommends that if you do want to put a dressing on the cork gasket, that you should use a number 2 non-hardening gasket sealer, and that's what I did. After cleaning it with a solvent, a thin layer was added around the perimeter, and the same was done for the cover panel. I also forgot to install these little brackets that hold down the lifter orientation brackets, so I did go back and do that later, don't worry. But seals were added and the cover panel was bolted down, along with some wiring loom retainers. Next is the very easy task of installing the valve cover. Nothing ever goes wrong with that. The very last thing to do on the block is replace the pilot bushing and rear main seal. And since those are on the back, I've got to get this thing off the stand. I bought a Harbor Freight pilot bearing puller, but it wasn't long enough to reach the end of the pilot bushing. So I ground down the arms to allow for more clearance, and then it came right out.
Alright.
I didn't have an installer tool though, so I just used the same extractor tool to line up the new one with the bore, and then hit it in there to get started. Then a block of wood was used as a cushion for the final drive home.
Alright.
A neat trick to getting the rear main seal off is to drill a small hole into it, and then pry it out through the small hole. That way you don't risk scarring the edge of the crank or the block, possibly causing there to be a bad seal. The bore was cleaned up thoroughly, and a new seal was oiled up and driven in using the old one. Next was the flywheel. It sure looked pretty rough when it came off the car, but after having it surfaced, It looked brand new. And from the factory, these bolts go on just as is, but now it's common practice to use thread locker on all of them. And these are new ones too. And after those were all torqued down to spec, I can now install the brand new, very small clutch kit. The clutch plate went on with the centering tool after cleaning the surface with brake clean, and then the pressure plate was also cleaned, added on, tightened down in a crisscross pattern, and then torqued to spec. Now, the engine is ready to be bolted up to the transmission and put on the subframe. But the subframe had seen better days, so I gave it a quick full restoration. Some spline lubricant came with the clutch kit to help everything install smoothly, so I applied a little bit of that. And now was the awkward dance of getting the two to meet up. I eventually got it and bolted the two halves together. With a little adjustment up at the front, the engine was installed. And after a lot more work overnight, we enter into the final touches phase. Distributor cap cleaned, new frame filter added, crank pulley bolted up, thermostat housing, dipstick, pretty much every single part of the engine, except these guys right here. There's a brand new starter, alternator, AC compressor, and water pump. I also did a near full restoration job on the intake assembly. Yeah, let's pop these onto the engine. With the last bolt tightened, my work here is done. At least for this episode. There's still the exhaust to sort out, belts to add, and a bunch of other little things. But holy crap, does this engine look good. It's a far cry from what it used to be, where if it wasn't rusty, it was covered in a layer of grime, all sitting on top of a sorry excuse for a subframe. And now? Yeah, I'm really happy with how this turned out, even if it's not quite done yet. It will be installed and running in the car in the next episode though. I think what I've done so far is more than enough for this video.
I really want to see this thing fire up right now, but like I think I already narrated, that's gonna have to wait till next episode, right?
Yep, that's what I said.
Yeah. But thank you so much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys later. Ow, shit. God damn it.